So, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah said some stuff in a USA Today article that he probably shouldn't have said, but I think we should delve into what he actually meant. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. Show is on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen, maybe your first watch of the day. Today's show, I want to talk about Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. He has done a little bit of a media thing here on the eves of training camp. Now, the players have reported to training camp. A little bit of news on that, too, coming up. But Adofo-Mensah he did a big feature with USA Today. That's going to be the main focus of this episode. He did a little bit of a press conference where he walked some of those things back because my dude put his foot in his mouth. In particular with some quotes about Kirk Cousins. We'll get to it. However, all of the players reported to training camp, and everybody who you expected to be there is there. No weird situations with that. And the only injury stuff we've actually already mentioned. I talked about it real briefly yesterday, but Nate Hairston is on non-football injury / active, so he'll miss the start of camp, but he is not on the physically unable to perform list. They're just going to hold him out for however many days, but that implies a more minor injury. And then there are the two players coming off of ACL injuries, Blake Prohl and Ryan Connolly, who also will not be there to start camp. That's it. And honestly, pretty good chance none of those guys make the team. So if they were healthy. So that's a very good starting place. Compare that to what they're dealing with in Green Bay. They've got like a dozen players on the pup, and they're like principal guys. They're, David Bakhtiari and Sammy Watkins. That's a situation that we can be glad that we're not in here. That's really nice. But when you think about who could have been on pup, who isn't, it's all really, really good news. Irv Smith, full go. And both Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi had a lot of great things to say about Irv Smith and the way that he attacked his rehab, and it seems like he's set. The meniscus thing is healed and as good as it's going to be, and that's that. And considering the operation that Irv Smith had, now, because he basically missed all of last season, that was a choice that you can make. I am speculating a little here, but if you have a meniscus problem, you can choose between two different procedures. One is more invasive, has a longer recovery time, but is less likely to experience problems down the road. And the other one is the one Anthony Barr got. And that one, he was able to come back more quickly, although it was pretty stupid because it was at the end of a dead season. But he would have maybe been able to come back for the playoffs if the Vikings had made it, and there was still technically a chance. So I think that's why they made that choice. A lesson they learned, because then he was dealing with like knee tendonitis and like degenerative knee issues. I shouldn't say degenerative. I don't know that, but like chronic reappearing knee issues. And a lot of that is just because there was some rushing in the first place. So now Irv Smith has done the more complete but more invasive procedure. He has now paid the price for doing that, the longer recovery time, and he should be at the same risk of anybody else to get another knee injury, right? Of course you are when you're a tight end, and if you've had surgery, it'll always be a little bit elevated, but I'm really excited about that. But also Danielle Hunter, not on PUP. Zadarius Smith, not on PUP. Andrew Booth, not on PUP. Not on any list. Feasibly good to go. That's all really, really, really exciting stuff. There's not a lot to analyze about it, but still bears mentioning. So let's return to Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. So he goes on this USA Today profile thing with Jory Epstein, and it's a fantastic article. You should absolutely read it. And you should read the whole thing too, especially if you start seeing quotes cropping up from it, you should read it. But here's the thing that got Kwesi in trouble. We're going to talk about a lot of the other stuff he says in here, but here's the thing that really got him in trouble. Let me just read the quote out loud verbatim so that you can have the entire piece of information. You can come to your own conclusion. And he said, I'll be frank, he told USA Today Sports during a sit down at his office conference table. The one asset where you get nervous about not burning it down is quarterback. He aims not to take a shot at a quarterback coming off a 4,220-yard, 33-touchdown season and believes indeed that he has a good quarterback. But, quote, we don't have Tom Brady and we don't have Pat Mahomes, which requires him to ask, is the Vikings quarterback perennially sufficient? It's more likely to win if you have that quarterback. It's very unlikely to have that quarterback. So that's what he said. That's the actual quote. And then the article spins into more of the process and procedural stuff, which is fascinating and a really good read. But that, oops, buddy, don't say that. So Kwesi gets in front of the media on Tuesday and walks it all back and says, yeah, I got to learn how to not say stuff like that. And, everybody says I should probably say less, which, yeah, you probably shouldn't have let that one rip, buddy. But, nobody disagrees. Nobody thinks that Kirk Cousins is better than Tom Brady. Even the most ardent, craziest Kirk people that I've seen out there don't have him above Tom Brady and Pat Mahomes. So, obviously, that is an obvious truth. But it's the kind of thing maybe don't say that to USA Today. But let's dive in, because here's where I get with these quotes. What did he mean to say? There's what he said. Kirk Cousins is not Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes. He wasn't asked to give his quarterback rankings. He was making a point here. And the point is that he's nervous about not having moved on from Kirk Cousins. So what I will always ask is, did he mean to say what that implies? And it kind of seems like he did. He also mentioned that, those two quotes were kind of put next to each other, but he didn't say them next to each other. If you notice, the sentence was a little broken up. And so he might not have necessarily meant to paint the picture in the way that the article did. But the part that sticks with me is the one asset where you get nervous about not burning it down is quarterback. That to me sounds like a little bit of a pang of regret for being locked into Kirk Cousins and going, could I have had my hands on somebody else? Was there a quarterback in this draft class that he really liked or something that he was, maybe thinking, oh, what if Kenny Pickett was on the board? Maybe he was in love with him or something like that. I certainly would not replace Kirk Cousins with Kenny Pickett, but who knows where his scouts were and what the evaluations were, right? We don't know what these draft boards look like. But I think the last part of that, too, where he says, look, of course it's more likely to win the Super Bowl if you have Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes. It's really hard to have Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes, which sort of feels like look, we have Kirk Cousins. That's who we have. And if you want to try to go get better than Kirk Cousins, then go for it. But they don't grow on trees, the Josh Allens of the world, right? So he's sort of, I think, willing to move forward with Kirk Cousins, but also acknowledging Kirk Cousins has flaws and we should be building around them. I think that's a healthy attitude for a GM to have. And I think that honesty is also healthy, right? You just don't maybe say that to the media, buddy. But for whatever it's worth, in his walk back session, he says, no, look, I talk to Kirk Cousins all the time and he knows where I stand on him and he knows where he stands in this organization. And that's all we really need here, right? And sure, that's all fine. I don't foresee, and this is what you get with these quotes. A lot of people go, oh my goodness, is there already conflict in the Vikings? And, the quarterback, everybody hates Kirk Cousins, and is there going to be a schism? No, there isn't. There is no schism, not that I know of. And if there turns out to be one later, we'll get into it. But what's more interesting to me is the way that Adofo-Mensah approaches things is very logical. And I find it's very funny because I super disagreed with extending Kirk Cousins. I talked about that ad nauseum at the time. But the process that led him to do it is the way he says it is okay, yeah, that's exactly how I would have approached things. And yeah, sure, his machine led him to that decision. And I would have put different inputs into the machine because I have different opinions. But I would have used the same machine and it would have spit out a different outcome because I put different opinions in. But I like the machine. And I want to talk about the machine. And I want to talk about some of the math stuff that he talked about. And just really dive into what I think makes Adofo-Mensah unique as a GM, for better or worse. But first, we've all been in a spot where you're low on cash. I've had cards declined in the past. I've had that kind of problem where you need to get lunch and, oh my goodness, I get paid tomorrow and I'm screwed. That is where Dave comes in. Dave is a banking app that can get you up to $500 extra cash with no interest and no credit check needed. So if you're in a pinch and you need some future help, download the Dave app and think of it as a helping hand from future you. You can buy like a wedding gift, catch up on your bills, just get those few gallons of gas in your tank that you need to get to work, just to make it, through the weekend, that kind of thing. Whatever it is, again, no interest, no credit check. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve. Member FDIC. Hey, so this weekend and every weekend until the first actual regular season game is played, I will be releasing one of my 7-part documentary series, one episode a week, on the history of the Minnesota Vikings. So this week, what is coming out is the origin story, how the Vikings started. Some of the stories will overlap with the stories we told over the summer, but there is way, way, way more in there for you to enjoy. You can find it on Zone Coverage or on my Patreon, but just keep an eye out on my Twitter for all of that stuff. My Patreon is patreon.com/Luke Braun NFL. Would love it if you joined. Let's move on with this Adofo-Mensah article. So the main point that Kwesi made in this was that he's such a quant. That's what he calls him. He's such a numbers guy, right? And the way he thinks is very numerical. Not only he incorporates a lot of stats and numbers, but in the way that like everything is information. And he talks about that a lot, whether it's written scouting reports. Well, that's just data. It's just a different kind of data in a different language. And I like to be multilingual. That's kind of what he talked about. And I really like that approach. Because I think too often we are like rejecting information. I do it too. I reject information. Sometimes when I reject information, it's because I think it's redundant with like some better version. I will reject yards and instead look at EPA, right? Because yards are meant to say how much did this guy produce, and EPA does a better job of how much did this guy produce. But also, I want to take in traits and what my own version of like the written scouting report is, which sometimes is literally that. Like I've got a bunch of big old notes on all the draft prospects, but sometimes it's just like a vibe, or it's just like an observation, a qualification that I notice on tape that says, this guy tends to step this way sometimes. And I don't know how many times he does it a game. I don't know what the EPA per that step is, but I noticed that he does it, and that's in my notes. And that's also data. And taking in all of that data is part of the process. The other thing Adofo-Mensah mentioned in that, with the other quote that kind of got him in trouble, was "you never go full Rams," which is an incredibly hilarious thing to say about a Super Bowl winner, right? At least that is such an outlandish quote, and it's so vague that it makes you want to go figure out, okay, what did he mean by that? And the point that he was making in there is a pretty good one. It's just the dumbest way to say it is by saying, like, you never want to do what those idiots over there with the Lombardi Trophy did. That won't be us. Like, come on, buddy. But wording aside, right? PR strategy aside, the point that he was making was that he didn't want to mortgage any one year to help another year, right? And I see that a lot. I contend with people who say that a lot. I argue against that a lot on this show too, that whether it's tanking this year so that I've got a better shot next year, or borrowing so much next year that it tanks so that I got a better shot this year. Both of those things are not things that I'm a huge fan of. Now, borrow a little money so that you can make ends meet this year, restructure, add $2.5 million in the next 3 years to make a little bit of cap space. That's fine, because I don't think that that's mortgaging the whole future. It's small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. But you're not going to do stuff like trade your entire 2023 draft for some superstar that you'd only have for a year, right? That kind of thing. And that's sort of closer to what the Rams did. They've traded all their first round picks away. Now, the thing about the Rams is that they don't care about picks. Like they just do not value picks very highly. So when they're making trades like for Jalen Ramsey or Von Miller or whatever, they're trading away draft picks that they don't think have a lot of value, and their trading partner does think it has a lot of value, which makes for a lot of easy deal making, and so they do a lot of it. But they don't believe that they're mortgaging their future, because I don't think they see draft picks as a huge part of their future. They just say, F them picks, right? And if you don't believe that, if you think that draft picks are valuable, you probably don't want to behave like the team that doesn't. I think that's more that like what he's saying. That you don't want to take it to such an extreme that, hey, if you get a bad call in the NFC Championship and you don't win the Super Bowl this year, that's it. We all lose our jobs over the next 3 years because we have nothing. Like, you don't want to do that, right? Don't Herschel Walker this and then go get blown out by the 49ers in round one of the playoffs in 1989, which is what happened, right? And I think not to be lost in all of this was, especially with his comments about Kirk Cousins. Well, Kirk Cousins came up again later in the conversation, and that Adofo-Mensah thinks that yes, he has enough to be a Super Bowl contender, and that the Vikings almost had enough to be a Super Bowl contender when Adofo-Mensah walked in the building. And his take, and he basically defended this, and the actions line up. His take is basically, yeah, we were about as a Darius Smith and a good draft away from being a contender. That is the take, or at least the public line, right? And if he earnestly believes that, basically this whole offseason makes sense. All right, we're going to keep everything together. We're not going to commit to Kirk Cousins for 5 years, but we'll keep him in, keep the cap reasonable, find a way to get Zadarius Smith in the building, and try our best to get a lot of players in the draft and do what we think is right in the draft, which is where they kind of had that talent band, I think is what he called it, in the second, third round, which is where he really focused everything, right? All of that adds up. There's no confusion to me, no problems. That's fine. When asked about all of this on Tuesday, he went on a whole thing about like thinking kind of probabilistically. And he says, a lot of these decisions, the most certain you can ever be about something in football is like 60-40, right? And we would love it if it were a 70-30 or an 80-20, and we can employ tools to try to make it better. But let's all be honest with ourselves. This is 55-45 at best. Nobody knows anything. We don't know who the good draft picks are. We don't know who the good free agents would be. If we did, the economy of free agency in the draft would all look a lot different, right? So how he approaches the verbiage he uses, decision-making under uncertainty. It's a very unwieldy term, but decision-making under uncertainty. How do you make a decision when you don't get to know everything about that decision? And a word leaked out of his brain, a Bayesian. And he said, it was like as an aside, like, oh, it's a Bayesian thing or a blah, blah, blah. But when he said Bayesian, I was like, I should talk about that. I think I've done it once before on this show. I did an article about a treasure hunt too. A very cool thing. But I think it warrants revisiting because Bayesian logic and just the basics of Bayes' theorem. This is going to be like math 101, y'all. If you're like a statistician or if you went to college and took math classes, this is not going to be new for you. But when we talk about how do you make a decision when you don't know everything you need to know to make that decision, that's where something like the Bayes principle or Bayes theorem or Bayes rule or whatever you want to call it comes in. We'll get to it. But hey, maybe a place where you're decision making under uncertainty when you're grambling. And if you feel like after this show you want to apply a little bit of Bayes' theorem and lay some wagers, you can do that on betonline.net. You can bet on all sorts of Vikings things like over-under Justin Jefferson yards or Adam Thielen. You can bet on their win total. Where will they place in the division? Will they make the playoffs? You can bet for that for any team. You can bet that kind of stuff for the MLB or WNBA or single games, or bet in the middle of games with their live betting thing. You can do player props and build out weird-ass parlays. I know y'all love to do that. You can do all that stuff at betonline.net, where the game starts. Allow me to take a brief detour into the world of math. I promise we'll come back to football. But Bayes' rule is a mathematical principle. I'm not going to kill you with the equations. If you want to learn more, Google it. But essentially, let me start with a hypothetical question. A guy named Steve. I'm like shamelessly ripping this off of the YouTube channel, 3 Blue, 1 Brown, by the way, who I think explains this in an awesome way. Go check that out. But take a guy named Steve. He is a meek and tidy soul. He is very learned. He seems to be kind of an academic. And he's not necessarily the life of any party, but a perfectly kind person with a soft voice. Is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Vote now on your phones. Now, most people would say, well, he sounds like a librarian. He's probably more likely to be a librarian. But what nobody ever really thinks to incorporate is the ratio of farmers that there are to the ratio of librarians that there are. There are a lot more farmers than librarians. So even though that description sounds more librarian-y than a farmer, because there are so many more farmers in the world, he's still going to be more likely to be a farmer. That is at the crux of Bayes' theorem. It is taking a prior knowledge and updating it when you learn more stuff. So the prior knowledge that we would have is that there are more farmers than librarians. Let's say there's 90 farmers and there's 10 librarians. And then we learn stuff about Steve that makes him, say, 4 times as likely to be a librarian than a farmer. Let's say that's what that description does. You've got 4 out of the 10 librarians fit that description. That could be Steve. And you got, say, 10 out of the 90 farmers are also meek and tidy and soft spoken. They just happen to be. You've got 10 farmers and 4 librarians. There's your proportion. It's 4 out of 14 that he's a librarian. There's your odds. But adding that new information, Bayes' theorem is the math that helps you incorporate that new information and update the probability. That is the super bare bones, and I'll be honest, I probably botched it, but that's the super bare bones kid you copied off in math class version, not the math professor, just the kid whose homework you can look at. Um, that idea of taking information, having some sort of model, some sort of predetermined belief. This is what I think about our odds to win the Super Bowl with Kirk Cousins, and then adding in information. Kirk Cousins got a new van. How much does that impact our ability to win the Super Bowl? That's what the Bayes thing is. And I think I find that stuff really fascinating. The treasure story is really fascinating. Where they basically like divided up this patch of ocean that they thought they were looking. This was like 1850s, a boat filled with gold sunk, and these guys were looking for it, and they used Bayesian math, which was the new information was it's not in this square. So they would search one square and they say, okay, it's not in this square. That affects the odds because if it's not in this square, the odds that we looked in the patch of ocean where it wasn't and it was the one right next to us are actually pretty low. And they actually had like information where they could sort of process of elimination gigantic patches of ocean by only checking one using Bayesian math. It only took them like 3 months to find the treasure, where in reality to search all of the ocean that it could have been in would have been a project that took years that nobody could afford and they would have never found it. So that's the power of Bayesian math. It can help you navigate stuff that you don't necessarily know and sort of defy the odds, if you will, if you've got that down. Ask anybody on analytics Twitter or ask anybody who's been in an analytics department. This is basic stuff that they learned 15 years ago. But hey, we're all just football fans here, all right? And now you can go be like, aha, you could like drop the Bayesian word and know that nobody else at the bar is going to be able to keep up with you and you're going to look super cool and super smart. So good for you. And that is, I think, something that the way it like leaked out of Kwesi, it seems like something that like an idea that he thinks about and evokes all the time. And I think that's pretty dope. Look, one of the weird things he said in the USA Today article was talking about how he's very different than other GMs, right? He didn't come from a scouting background or really even a football background. He's like a Wall Street guy. He's a quant. He's a math guy. And that says, okay, yeah, that's my weakness is that I probably know less about football than every other GM, but I know more about math than every other GM. And a lot of those guys don't know anything about math, and I know plenty about football. So my weakness is better than their weaknesses, and I'm the best math guy ever, and that's going to be my thing. I don't know if that's necessarily how that plays out because it's way more important to know about football than it is to know about math when you're GM of a football team. But it's undeniable that having that probabilistic mind, not just having a lot of knowledge, which he does, but also having a brain that thinks that way is going to be an advantage in some cases. It's going to help you navigate trades. It's going to help you navigate contracts and stuff, which I think the Vikings are, as long as Brzezinski's in the building, the Vikings will be one of the best in the league at that. Obviously, the cop-out thing I have to say, time always will tell, right? None of this conversation will matter in 3 years when we know how guys like Andrew Booth or Lewis Cine really panned out. That's going to be what colors our perception of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. But perhaps in the immediate future, might want to work on those PR skills, buddy, because you got your foot in your mouth right now. And I don't think we should take any offense to it. Doesn't sound like Kirk Cousins is going to take any offense to it. And I don't think he really should. It's pretty clear that Adofo-Mensah didn't mean to like disparage his quarterback or anything. And everybody can probably pretty easily move on. I just think it's funny, buddy. All right, put your foot in your mouth and move on. Tomorrow, oh, maybe I'll talk a little about Irv Smith. Maybe I don't know if I'll be able to get any more history in because camp is ramping up and we're going to have stuff to talk about. But if we do have time to kill, I'm always down to bring up random 1996 games or something. So we'll do that if we have to. But otherwise, whatever tomorrow brings, I will see you then. And as always, Skull.